Hello, this is Trevor Flowers from Transmutable with another episode talking about making 20 Tiny Memex. Now that prototype 2 is built, which is what you're seeing in the video here, I think it's a good time to talk about exactly what it is that the product itself will include and how I expect people might use it. So the short story is that the Tiny Memex is an enclosure for small computers like the Raspberry Pi or one of the Adafruit featherboards. And it has two tiny screens, and it has buttons and a lever so that it can accept input without having an external display or without having an external keyboard or mouse or anything like that. So it's a really nice handmade wood enclosure for something like a Raspberry Pi. That's the short story. I'm hoping that one of the things that happens is that people decide to use them to host their own private intellectual infrastructure. So a Raspberry Pi can run anything, right? It can run an ad blocker on your network. It can run file storage. It can run any number of things. But I'm hoping that because the Tiny Memex references a time when people were really thinking pretty deeply about how to have people, specifically academics, think deeply about complex problems and then share those thoughts in a way that couldn't be done with linear documents. I'm hoping that will inspire people to think for themselves about how they can host their own software on these little devices in such a way that it's both private, so it's not running on someone else's servers, like the cloud, and it's a place to experiment. So everything from wikis to shared documents to audio recording systems to any number of things that they could put together. I hope it will be a fertile ground for people to experiment with improving how they think and what they think. To get into the details a little bit more, this will be a 1/6 scale miniature, and it will have two displays, digital displays. They're 2.8 inches diagonal. They'll be TFTs. This display enclosure will have controls, so the 35 buttons in the grid on the control panel, and then the three below the document pattern, those buttons will have little circuit boards underneath them that actually accept the inputs and can feed them into the computer. Right now I'm planning to use CircuitPython running in the Raspbian OS. Adafruit has quite a nice ecosystem of software for handling input and running the displays. So anybody who can write a Python script will be able to make the tiny computer react to button presses and lever pulls, as well as put pictures or text up on the display. As far as production timeline goes and the number of Memex that I will be creating, my original goal was to have a set of 20 made and to have them done by the beginning of 2022. That has been pushed back a little bit. Obviously, my health has been sort of problematic, so I haven't had as much time to work on this as I thought I would. And also, it's just been a little bit hard to figure out which electronics components I can actually get a hold of these days. The global chip panini is kind of a problem, even for small run like this. A lot of people have asked me whether I have bigger plans for additional runs in the future. I don't at this point. In some ways, I don't know if there are enough people in the world who are interested in buying Tiny Memex. So in some ways, this is a market experiment. There's always a possibility that there's a big demand that I didn't expect. But if that's the case, then I would have to look into making something that is sort of a different scale and a different amount of work. So at this point, this 20 is the 20 that I plan on making. Here is the point when I begin to realize that I have made a terrible mistake. My cutting guide printed out at 95% scale instead of full scale, which means that all of my cuts of these braces that go inside the Tiny Memex are in fact a little bit short. So you'll see here I'm laying them out against the walls of the desk part, which are correctly sized, and realizing that they don't match up with the proper length. And so at this point, I'm trying to think how this could happen. I don't yet know that the print is wrong, so I'm putting things next to each other. I'm measuring. I'm considering whether I have the wrong pieces set up for these assemblies. I'm checking that the walls are the right size, and I'm just sort of stunned that things are so off. You know, like, is my technique for cutting these braces wrong? So this is a classic moment where I have a choice. I can either recut all of these pieces, which I would totally do on a production unit, but this is a prototype. So the question is, can I get the information that I need out of the prototype without redoing that work? And the answer is yes. So I'm starting the glue up, I'm making the assembly, and I'm moving ahead with this prototype, even though I know that a lot of the fitment will be almost entirely wrong, and that the outside shape will be right, but the inside connections will be incorrect. So here I am munging, manually cutting things down, changing sizes to make it at least strong enough to be a working prototype. One of the pieces of work that's left to do is to write down the entire process, start to finish, of buying, prepping, and then assembling the pieces of the Tiny Memex body. There's a lot of pieces and parts to it. It would be easy to skip a step, and then having the process written down will actually let me make templates so that I don't have to manually measure things. That will bring a level of consistency and rapidity to these cuts that I think will be very welcome when I'm going into production mode and making a lot of them in series. I've had a couple of people ask me why I put tape on brand names, even of equipment or pieces and parts that are obviously from some well-known brand, some well-known company. I do that for myself because I feel more relaxed if I'm not surrounded by brands all the time. I have a bit of sensitivity to that sort of thing, so it helps me. But also, you're watching a video. Let's take a break from big brands and from people who are trying to sell us on some vision that they have for their tools, and let's just focus on one thing. Let's focus on building the best Tiny Memex that we can, and making the best design that we can. I'm always happy in comments to answer questions about which tools I'm using, which materials I'm using, that sort of thing. So feel free to go in the comments and ask those questions, and I'll try to answer them. One of the things I learned pretty early on in my career is that, 70 to 80% of any job is going to be a little bit of drudgery. So looking out for opportunities to reduce the drudgery is one of the things you can do during the drudgery. But also, there are very few jobs where it's all glorious mind work and glorious final assembly at all times. So getting comfortable with this kind of repetitive work is part of the job. So this part I'm working around right here is the single board computer adapter. So that's what you connect something like a Raspberry Pi to, and then it slides into the Tiny Memex. So you can see that board with the two braces on the sides. That slides up against the back modesty wall of the Tiny Memex. And so here, right now I'm working on the fronts, the fake drawer fronts. There's a couple of modifications that I need to make based on how this prototype worked out. So it was actually really informative to do that work. Here I am putting in the fake drawer pull for the middle drawer. Again, sized incorrectly. I chose to build this prototype out of a variety of woods. So there's some cherry and walnut and maple. I think a little maybe a little ash or birch. I can't remember which, but I'm pretty happy with the cherry sheetwood and rods that I can get locally. They're domestic, so they're not shipped across continents, so they don't take quite as much, they don't have quite as much carbon footprint. But also, I just really like the cherry, and especially how it reacts to the oil that I am planning to put on this. But I thought it was worth trying some different materials to see how they machined, to see how I liked working with them, and then how they looked. I am 100% certain at this point that the 20 Memex that I'm going to build are going to be made of cherry, modulo any inability for me to get enough of it. Here I am installing a Raspberry Pi 4 onto the adapter plate, and I learned a couple of things. One, there needs to be either inset screw holes or there needs to be channels cut into that top back brace in order for the screws to slide down, the screws that are on the back of the adapter to slide past that top bar. I haven't decided which way to go yet. Here I am remounting the Raspberry Pi a little bit higher because I wanted the cable length to be a little shorter. So these cables are temporary, just bodges to get everything working and test out the displays in the context of this prototype. Once I have everything working and I have the circuit diagram nailed down, I can order cables that will, take care of this rat's nest. These cables pull apart rather simply. Here I am actually resoldering the ground wire on this display. Came off, so I had to resolder it. The Raspberry Pi is running the Raspberry Pi version of CircuitPython, and it's using the Adafruit libraries for SPI control of these displays, which is just a little bit of lingo, which basically means that there's an open source way that from your Raspberry Pi you can make those tiny displays show whatever you want. Here I'm setting up for some glamour shots. I 3D printed those little supports that are on the side of the white butcher paper. And then what's next after prototype 2 is to make all of the production tools like templates, like I mentioned earlier, and then to design the circuit boards that go under the control panel and the buttons underneath the platen. But I'm pretty happy with this process so far. I'm pretty happy with the shape and feel of the wooden parts. And so assuming I can get my prints at the correct scale so that all of my cuts are the correct length, I think we're honing in on what the actual device will look like. So if you like this, go ahead and subscribe, hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.